Hi, welcome back to Joe Blogs. In today's episode, I want to provide you with an update as to what's happening in the Russian economy. Now, as you'll know, the data that we receive from the Russian Finance Ministry is highly limited. We don't get the same level that we get for lots of other countries. So it's quite difficult to do a forensic assessment of a lot of the figures. However, once a month, we do get official figures posted by the Ministry of Finance from Russia. And in today's video, we're going to go through that data. Now, this is something that I've been doing on a monthly basis. And I think what we're starting to see is a very interesting trend. Oil and gas revenues are down significantly. That's no major surprise to anybody that follows this channel because the sanctions have caused major problems for Russia. They're now selling significantly more volume of oil to India and China. But there are two problems with that. Firstly, it's being sold at a discount, so they're earning less than they would have been historically. And secondly, India and China are only really interested in buying crude oil, which is basically the most simple form of oil, which is the cheapest. Russia make more profit from refined oil sales, the sale of gasoline, diesel, kerosene, all of those finished products. But neither India nor China want to buy large volumes of that because they've got their own refineries. They can do it themselves. And there's value to be added when you put crude oil through the refinery process, because either you can make those sales into your home market or you can decide to export those finished products yourself. So countries such as India, which don't actually have large reserves of oil themselves, can actually make money from exporting oil. So Russia has lost a huge amount of revenue from its oil and gas businesses, and those losses are continuing. You'll see in today's data that they're down by around 70% compared to where Russia was in 2021, which was the last full year that had no impact of the war in Ukraine. So I'll go through those figures in some details. But one of the things that is coming out from the data that Russia is providing monthly is that there's been a massive increase in non-oil and gas revenues. And that obviously raises the question as to what are these non-oil and gas revenues? Where is Russia getting this extra revenue from? What's it actually doing? What's it exporting? So in today's video, we'll go through that in some more detail. We'll have a look at the different categories that are provided by the Ministry of Finance and dig down to find out exactly where this extra income is coming from. We'll then have a look at total revenue, we'll look at total expenditure, and that has gone up significantly, predominantly as a result of what Russia is investing into the war in Ukraine. And then we'll have a look at what the bottom line is for Russia, whether or not they're posting a net profit or a net loss. And I'll give you a heads up, spoiler alert, they're making a net loss. But we'll have a look at how that compares to 2022 and 2023. And also what's likely to happen in December, because each year Russia passes huge amounts of cost through its P&L in the final month of the year. And that's likely to happen again in 2023 and drag the figures down further. And one of the things that I'm sure you'll be aware of if you're following the channel is that the Russian ruble has collapsed in value over the course of the last year. So in today's video, I'll provide you with some comparisons, not just in Russian rubles, which are what these figures are posted in, but we'll also look at what those Russian rubles were worth in US dollars each year, because the exchange rate has obviously been changing, so we need to use a different exchange rate for each of the years. And then finally today I'll wrap up with my summary as to what I think the overall impact of the sanctions is on the Russian economy and what's likely to happen over the course of the next 3 to 6 months. But before we get started on all of that, I'd like to say thank you so much to everybody that's bought me a coffee or sent me a YouTube super thanks recently. Really appreciate that. And also thank you so much to everyone that's joined Patreon and the YouTube membership scheme. We're building a really nice community and I'm really trying to put some time aside to make some videos that are just for you guys. So keep watching, there'll be more of those coming. And if you'd like to see more face-to-face videos and find a way of avoiding all of the adverts on YouTube, then check out my Patreon channel. However, if you don't like Patreon, please have a look below where you'll find links to the YouTube membership scheme, as well as buy me a coffee and YouTube super thanks. I'm frequently asked in the comments section below to quote all of the sources of the information that I'm using. And as I've said before, it would really just take me too long to be able to list everything because I'm sourcing data from a whole lot of different places. However, in today's video, the only source of information that I'm using is the Ministry of Finance of the Russian Federation. So these are basically the official figures that are being posted by Russia on a monthly basis. And as I said right at the beginning of the video, the data that we're getting from Russia is highly limited right now. So any official data that's being released is highly valuable, and that's why I'm dedicating a video every single month to these figures. So if you want to check out this data yourself, go to minfin.gov.ru. If you want to read it in English, put /en and then /document, and that takes you to the official documents that are being posted every single month. And if we scroll down this page, you can see there are 4 brief information documents that have been posted, and this 4th one is the one that we're looking for. So if we click into this, it then takes us into the breakdown of the brief monthly information on the federal budget execution, cumulative from the beginning of the year in billions of rubles. And if we scroll down, it's the total revenue, oil and gas revenue, non-oil and gas revenue. It's this section that we want. And as you can see, these figures date back to January 2011. And we've got a lot of detail here. If we scroll down, you can see that we're getting a breakdown of expenditure historically into all the different portions. And then we've got lots of other information. However, the data does become a bit more limited as we go forward. So if we scroll further to the right to get to the 2023 figures, you can see that we've now got all of the figures for September here. However, that's only for the top section. The section for expenditure, which would give us a detailed breakdown of what's happening with regards to the investment in the war in Ukraine, we haven't got any of that information for the last 18 months or so. But this data is going to give us some valuable insights into what's happening in the economy. But it's pretty difficult to be able to interpret. I don't think a video of me talking about these numbers using this format is going to be particularly interesting. So what I've done is transposed all of those figures into a spreadsheet dating back to the start of 2021. And the reason that I've done that is to give us a comparison to a year prior to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, because comparing this year against last year obviously is relevant and important. However, 2022's results were obviously impacted by the war in Ukraine. There were some positive impacts from Russia's point of view in terms of the big increase in oil and gas prices at the start of the war. However, there were also some negative factors in terms of all of the sanctions. So 2021 gives us a fair comparison to a year that wasn't impacted by what's happening in Ukraine. So I've transposed all of those figures into this data, but obviously this data isn't particularly user-friendly either. It's quite similar to what we just saw from the Ministry of Finance. So what I've done to make it a bit more user-friendly is put all of that data into some nice graphs. So let's get into the detail and have a look at what's happening with oil and gas revenue. This chart shows the cumulative growth in oil and gas revenue for the Russian economy for 2021, 2022 and 2023. And cumulative basically just means they were adding each month on top of the previous month. So essentially the figure for December on the right-hand side of the 2021 and 2022 figures represents the full year income for Russia. And to make it easier to pick out the data, I've included tabs all the way along these lines so you can see the actual figures are quoted for each month. And at the bottom, I've included a table which shows the 3 different years. And in terms of which year's which, the grey line at the top of this chart is 2021, so the year that was entirely unaffected by the war and the sanctions. The orange line is 2022, and the blue line at the bottom is the current year, 2023. So before we get into the detail, let's take a step back and look at the obvious point here. The revenue for oil and gas sales in 2021 was significantly higher than it was in 2022 and 2023. And equally, if we look at the comparison between this year and last year, Russia's revenue from oil and gas sales was higher in every single month last year than it is in this year. And if you now look at the shape of the chart for 2022, you can see that between January and April, the revenue was tracking at a lower level than 2021. However, from May onwards, the divergence starts to get significantly wider. And the reasons for that are twofold. Firstly, the sanctions are being applied against Russia, which resulted in an immediate contraction in the volume of sales that Russia was achieving. But also, as we moved into the second half of 2022, there was a global slowdown, which resulted in a general reduction in the price of oil. So Russia was facing 2 headwinds. Firstly, it saw a drop in volumes, and secondly, it saw a drop in the price of the oil that it was selling. And I think it's really interesting to note that in every single month in 2023, oil and gas revenues have been lower than they were in 2022. So there's been a lot of talk about how successful Russia has been in selling more volume to India and China. However, when you look at the overall picture, total revenue from oil and gas sales is lower than it was last year and is significantly lower than it was in 2021. If we now look at the details for the first 9 months of 2023, you can see that total revenue is 5.6 trillion rubles. And that compares to revenue of 8.5 trillion rubles for the first 9 months of 2022, which represents a reduction of around 35%. However, if you compare the 5.5 trillion rubles for 23 against the 17.9 trillion rubles that Russia earned in the first 9 months of 2021, that represents a fall of 69%. And as I mentioned right at the start of this section, the reason that I'm comparing these figures against 2021 is that's a normal year for Russia, not affected by what's happening in Ukraine. And I think this really highlights the devastating impact that the sanctions are having on Russia's business. It's lost more than 2/3 of its revenue from its most valuable exports. But unfortunately for Russia, the situation is actually worse than that, because you need to take into account what's happening with the Russian ruble. Since the start of the war in Ukraine, the value of the ruble has collapsed. This time 12 months ago, $1 was trading for around 60 Russian rubles. Today, it's trading for 95. And if you follow the channel, you'll know that the reason that it's trading for 95 is because Russia have actually introduced some capital controls. President Putin recently issued a decree forcing some of the exporting businesses in Russia to sell around 75% of all of their foreign currency in exchange for rubles to keep the value of the ruble high. So without that measure being introduced, it's highly likely that the value of the ruble would be significantly more than 100 to $1. Now, the reason that the exchange rate between the US dollar and the ruble is highly relevant when we're talking about oil and gas is that a lot of contracts are still struck in US dollars. That's why the dollar is often referred to as the petrocurrency, because lots of countries are comfortable agreeing deals in dollars. So if we now compare the US dollar equivalent of the revenue that Russia is earning from oil and gas sales, the year-to-date figure of 5.6 trillion rubles for the period to September 2023 at an exchange rate of 95 rubles to $1 equates to $58.7 billion. And if we compare that to 2022, the 8.5 trillion rubles at an exchange rate of $1 to 60 rubles equated to $142 billion. So that represents a year-on-year reduction in income of $83 billion. However, if we compare the current level to 2021, the exchange rate in September 21 was $1 to 72 rubles. And therefore the income of 17.9 trillion rubles for the first 9 months of 21 equated to $249 billion, which means that the income in the first 9 months of this year is $190 billion less than it was in 2021. And once again, that really shows how big an impact the sanctions are having on the Russian economy. This chart shows all Russian non-oil and gas revenue for 2021, 2022 and 2023. And I think what stands out immediately when you're looking at this chart is the fact that the three lines are completely reversed from what we've just seen for oil and gas revenue. The grey line at the bottom represents 2021, the orange line in the middle represents 2022, and the blue line at the top is for 2023. And what that tells us is that there was a remarkable increase in non-oil and gas revenue in 2022, and that increase has continued into 2023. Now, in order to get a better understanding of what non-oil and gas revenue actually relates to, I think it's worth looking at the categories that are provided by the Ministry of Finance from Russia. The biggest single category is domestic production. So this is basically things that Russia are producing that don't relate to oil and gas. And in the 9 months to September 2023, this figure equated to 7.6 trillion rubles, which equates to around $80 billion. Now, we don't have any form of breakdown of domestic production, but there has been a lot of discussion about the fact that Russia is now operating as a wartime economy, and there is clearly a lot of investment into the ongoing war in Ukraine. So the large increase in domestic production could be explained by the Russian economy basically ordering more military equipment. However, these are obviously not genuine sales. When you're talking about exports, you make things and then you sell them to other countries in exchange for cash. When you're talking about investing into military equipment or something that's going to be used in the war, obviously the buyer of that equipment is the Russian government. You're not selling it overseas in exchange for cash. So this is basically a way of the Russian authorities boosting the figures for the Russian economy by putting more money into military spending. However, obviously that's not going to benefit Russia in the long term. This isn't a business that they're building that's going to bring in revenue for the next 50 years. So all of that military investment can really be classified as a short-term blip. The next biggest category in non-oil and gas revenue is VAT, value added tax. So this is basically taxes that are being taken from Russian businesses. And once again, a short-term increase in taxes is a good way of boosting your figures in terms of non-oil and gas revenue. However, the long-term implications could be damaging to the Russian economy, because if you're taxing your businesses too highly and therefore they don't have enough free cash to be able to reinvest, buy more capital, employ more people, then the long-term implication of that will be negative. And in a similar vein, the next two biggest categories are imports, which were 4.1 trillion rubles, or around $49 billion, and VAT on imports, which were 3.2 trillion rubles, or around $38 billion. And what we're seeing here is the Russian authorities applying tax to anything that's being imported. So once again, this is a good way of boosting your short-term income to make the figures look better. However, if you keep taxing everything heavily, it will have two impacts. Firstly, it will start to drive up inflation because there's going to be a knock-on impact in terms of the actual consumer price. And secondly, it's going to reduce the profits of any of the companies that are involved in those imports. So again, the long-term implication here is negative, because if those companies are making less profit, then they're less likely to reinvest into their businesses, and they're potentially less likely to want to expand. And the final category that I wanted to highlight here is tax on profits, which for the first 9 months of 2023 equated to 1.4 trillion rubles, or around $15 billion. And the issue here is exactly the same. If you increase your tax on profits, obviously that boosts non-oil and gas revenue, so that's great from that point of view. But once again, it potentially has a negative long-term implication, because if you're taking too much tax off companies and individuals, then they won't have money to reinvest into their businesses. And so long-term, we may see a reduction in the turnover and therefore the profits of those businesses. So if we now return to the graph, I think we've now got a better perspective as to why the non-oil and gas revenue has been increasing in 2022 and 2023. The Russian authorities have been basically looking for ways to be able to get these figures up, and they've done that in two ways. Firstly, they boosted the economy by converting it into a wartime economy and investing heavily into things relating to the war. And secondly, they've increased the level of taxation to be able to bring in more short-term revenue. However, the long-term implications of both of these actions is potentially damaging for the Russian economy. And if we have a look at the figures for the first 9 months of 2023, you can see that non-oil and gas revenue is 14.2 trillion rubles, which equates to around $149 billion. And that represents an uplift of 2.9 trillion rubles, or 26% compared with 2022. However, when we compare the current year figure to the figure for 2021, it represents an increase of 8 trillion rubles, which is significantly more than double the figure achieved in a normal year for Russia. And of course, one of the reasons that Russia has taken this action is to increase its total revenue figures. This chart shows a comparison in Russia's total revenue, so non-oil and gas and oil and gas revenues, for 21, 22 and 23. And the overall takeaway of this chart is that the difference between the 3 years is much smaller than it was in the first two graphs that we looked at. If we start off by looking at the difference between 2022 and 2021, you can see that in the first 5 months, there is virtually no gap between the grey and the orange lines. However, the two lines do separate from June onwards, and there is a clear differential by the end of the year, and the figures for December 2022 were around 19% lower than they were for 2021. If we now look at the figures for 2023, you can see that the figures for the first 5 months came in lower than they did for 22 and 21. However, the blue and the orange lines actually join in August, and the figures for September are virtually identical. Total revenue for the first 9 months of 2023 came in at 19.7 trillion rubles, which is around $208 billion at the current exchange rate. And that represents a shortfall in Russian rubles of around 18% compared with the figures for 2021. However, if we compare the figures using the equivalent exchange rate for US dollars for 2021, the shortfall is actually around 40%. So what this chart shows is that despite all of the increase in non-oil and gas revenue reported by the Russian authorities in 2023, there is still a significant decrease in total revenue, which is a direct result of the sanctions that are being applied against Russia. This chart shows Russia's total expenditure for the last 3 years. And what's interesting about this chart is that expenditure is continuing to increase. The grey line at the bottom represents the figures for 2021, the orange line in the middle represents 2022, and the blue line at the top represents 2023. Now, as we discussed earlier in the video, Russia are no longer providing a breakdown of this expenditure. They're not giving any details on how much is being invested into the war in Ukraine. But what we can see from these figures is that they're now spending a lot more than they were in the previous 2 years. Total expenditure for the first 9 months of this year was 21.4 trillion rubles, which equates to around $225 billion at the current exchange rate. That represents an increase of around 1.9 trillion rubles compared with 2022, which is an increase of about 10%, but represents an increase of more than 5 trillion rubles, or around 32%, compared with total expenditure for 2021. And clearly a large portion of this increase in expenditure relates to the investment that Russia is continuing to make into the war in Ukraine. This chart shows the bottom line, so basically the difference between income and expenditure for each of the 3 years. So if we start off by looking at the situation for 2021, Russia posted a net profit throughout the whole of that year, and the total profit for the year equated to 9.6 trillion rubles, which equated to around $133 billion. If we now look at the orange line, you can see that in the first 11 months of 2022, Russia also posted a net profit. However, the net profit of 743 billion rubles that was posted in November 2022 transformed into a net loss in December of 3.3 trillion rubles, or around $55 billion. And interestingly, if you look at the figures for 2021, you can see that in that month there was also a net loss posted, which reduced the total profit for the year from 10.7 trillion rubles to 9.6. If we now look at the situation for 2023, you can see that Russia has posted a net loss in every single month. Now, between January and May, the loss was actually increasing. However, in June, July, August and September, the situation has started improving. So the net loss has been reducing. And the total figure for the 9 months to September is now standing at 1.7 trillion rubles, which represents a year-to-date loss of around $18 billion. However, the year-to-date loss compares to a profit of 203 billion rubles for the first 9 months of 2022. And if the Russian budget follows the same course as it has in the last 2 years, it's extremely likely that the figures for December will be a huge loss, and therefore it's highly likely that Russia is going to post another net loss for the full year of 2023. So what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, I wanted to post this video firstly to give you the data that's been provided by the Ministry of Finance from Russia. These are the official figures. They're not my figures. I've just put them into a spreadsheet and pulled together some graphs to make them easier to analyse. And what we've seen from today's data is that oil and gas revenue is suffering significantly. It's down almost 70% against where Russia was in 2021. And I think 2021 is the most important year when we're comparing where Russia is today, because the year-on-year comparison against 2022, whilst it's important, is comparing against the year that was also impacted by the sanctions. And as we saw from today's data, the oil and gas revenue for 23 is around 35% down against where it was this time last year. But it's down by around 70% against 2021. That is a complete disaster from Russia's point of view, because they're still pumping large volumes of oil. The oil industry is still running in Russia, so they're still employing the same amount of people and incurring the same level of cost. But their income is down by 70%. And of course, when you have a business like this, which has very high fixed costs, a fall in income falls straight through to the bottom line. And that's why Russia is posting huge deficits, because it's lost all that revenue, but it's still having to pay for everything. Now, based on the fact that the Russian economy is built around oil and gas, it's its biggest industry, you would have expected total revenue to also be down significantly. However, as we've seen from today's data, non-oil and gas revenue is up significantly, both against 2022 and 2021. And the reason for that is twofold. Firstly, the Russian authorities have ramped up their military spending, so they're investing a lot more into the economy to keep the war in Ukraine going. So that's given a short-term boost to the economy. And secondly, they've ramped up taxes. So they're trying to take as much tax as possible out of everything, out of profits and imports. But the problem with both of those actions is that they're not good for the long-term future of the Russian economy. Once the war in Ukraine comes to an end, assuming that it does at some point, then all of that military spending will stop. So that would obviously lead to a huge fall in non-oil and gas revenue. Now, Russia may be thinking that it can counterbalance that with a large increase in oil and gas revenue. However, it really depends on what happens. Because if you look at countries such as Iran and Venezuela, they're not currently at war with anybody. They haven't had sanctions applied against them because they're in a military conflict. It's because of what's happening in the country itself. So the West may well decide that these sanctions should stay in place indefinitely, even if the war in Ukraine did come to an end, because the relationship between Russia and the West has been seriously damaged. So if that happens, there won't be a huge increase in oil and gas revenues, but there will definitely be a fall as a result of the end of the war in terms of the military spending within Russia. And if we look at the situation with regards to taxes, increasing taxes obviously represents a boost of income for the Russian economy. But if those taxes get to the point where they're too penal, they're costing those companies too much, they're not able to have enough cash flow to reinvest into their businesses and hire more people, then in the long term, that will be detrimental to the Russian economy. So you can plump up your figures as much as you like by improving non-oil and gas revenues, but the long-term impact of that could be highly damaging. The other issue that's coming through very clearly from Russia's figures is that expenditure is continuing to increase. Russia is continuing to invest in the war in Ukraine. So the figures for 2023 are higher than 2022 and significantly higher than 2021. So when you get a combination of a fall in revenue and an increase in expenditure, obviously it's going to put pressure on your bottom line, and that's exactly what we've seen today. The 2023 figures are in the red. Russia is posting net losses, and that compares to a net profit for 2022. Surprisingly, the full year figure was a net loss, but in the first 11 months, Russia posted month-on-month profits. So 2023 is worse than 2022, and it is significantly worse than 2021. At this point in 2021, Russia was posting a huge profit. And as we saw from the details of how the Russian economy works, it's very likely that there will be a large amount of cost posted against the P&L in December. That's what's happened in 2021 and 2022. So it's likely that the losses that Russia is currently incurring will increase significantly by the end of this year. And that obviously will then put further pressure on Russia's resources because they're having to fund their losses at the moment using their National Wealth Fund. And if they keep doing that, there comes a point when the National Wealth Fund runs dry and Russia could seriously run out of cash. And there were recently reports that Russia has currently enough money to keep this war going until the end of 2024 or 2025, depending on what happens with oil and gas revenues. And one of the things that will have a large bearing on the potential for Russia to run out of cash is what's happening with the Russian ruble. And if you've been following the channel, you'll know that we've talked a lot about the ruble recently. It's collapsed in value. This time last year, $1 was trading for around 60 Russian rubles. Today, it's trading at 95. And as I mentioned earlier in the video, the reason that it's trading at 95 is because Russia have now introduced restrictions, which means that a lot of their exporters are having to exchange foreign currency for rubles to boost the value of the ruble. Now, since those controls were introduced, we have seen an improvement in the value of the ruble, but it hasn't really been that significant. Prior to the controls coming in, the ruble was trading for more than 100 against the US dollar. It's now at 95, so not really a major improvement. And as we move forward through the rest of 2023, we could see the value of the ruble falling again, which will apply further pressure onto the Russian economy. And the final fact that I haven't mentioned so far today is the ban on the export of refined products. That was introduced by the Russian authorities on the 21st of September. So we haven't really seen the full impact of that in today's figures. It's likely that we'll see a big impact on oil and gas revenues in the October figures, which will come out in a month or so's time. And if we see a further fall in the oil and gas revenues, unless that's offset by non-oil and gas revenues again, it's likely that we'll see a bigger loss being posted in October, and that will feed through to the full year figure for 2023. And as I've mentioned before, that export ban has not been fully lifted. It's been lifted with regards to diesel, but out of every barrel of oil that goes through a refinery, there's around 2/3 gasoline and 1/3 diesel. So gasoline is the biggest part of the refinery process from Russia's point of view, and therefore will have a big impact on its oil and gas revenues. So the overall summary of today's video is that oil and gas revenues continue to be significantly down against where they were in both 2022 and 2021. Russia is offsetting that partially by improving its non-oil and gas revenues. But as we've talked about, that isn't going to be a sustainable situation and isn't helping grow the Russian economy in the long term. And the bottom line from Russia's point of view is that they're still posting net deficits, and it's likely that we will see a large deficit being posted at the end of 2023. And there is a risk, if Russia continues spending at the current rates, that it could run out of cash at some point over the next 12 to 18 months. So hopefully you've enjoyed today's episode, you found it useful, informative and thought-provoking. If you've liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Thank you for watching this video all the way through to the end, and here's something to put a smile on your face.